Rome, 65 AD. The air in the city was thick with fear. Emperor Nero had just uncovered, or invented, a conspiracy against his life, and he was hunting down anyone who might have inspired resistance to his rule. Senators were executed, poets were silenced, and philosophers, the ones who dared to speak of virtue and self-mastery in an age of tyranny, were rounded up as if their ideas alone were weapons. Among them was a quiet, disciplined teacher named Musonius Rufus, a man who had spent his life arguing that philosophy was not an academic hobby for the wealthy, but a practical training ground for how to live, for anyone, of any class, of any gender. Nero did not care for nuance. He cared that Musonius Rufus taught people to think for themselves, and that was dangerous enough. The sentence came swiftly: exile, not to a comfortable villa on the coast, but to Gyaros, a small, sun-blasted, nearly waterless island in the Aegean Sea, a place the Romans used specifically because almost no one survived it with their spirit intact. Gyaros was infamous long before Musonius arrived. Roman writers described it as a place fit only for the condemned, a jagged, treeless rock rising out of the sea, with almost no fresh water, punishing heat, and no soil worth farming. Prisoners sent there were not expected to build lives. They were expected to disappear, forgotten by history, ground down by thirst and isolation until either the island or their own despair finished the job. For most exiles, that was exactly what happened. They arrived as men of standing and became shadows, counting days, resenting the sea that surrounded them like a wall. Musonius stepped off the boat into that same brutal landscape. He had lost his rank, his students, his comfortable life in Rome, and very possibly his future. He was, by any practical measure, powerless. But he carried with him the one thing Nero's soldiers could not confiscate: decades of trained judgment about what actually deserved to disturb a person's peace of mind, and what did not. The rock was real. The suffering it was meant to produce was optional. Instead of collapsing into the role assigned to him, Musonius began doing something almost absurd for a man on a death sentence island. He kept teaching. He held informal lessons on the rocks, speaking to whoever would listen, and soon, remarkably, people did listen. Word spread across the Aegean that the exiled philosopher on Gyaros was still holding class, still answering questions about grief, anger, desire, and duty as calmly as if he were back in a Roman lecture hall. Students began making the dangerous crossing by boat just to sit with him for an afternoon and sail home again. Some historians even recorded that men swam long distances through open water to reach the island, unwilling to let a state sentence cut them off from a teacher worth learning from. Think about the strangeness of that image. A punishment engineered to erase a man's influence instead amplified it, because his mind had become more valuable to people than his freedom of movement ever was. The empire could move his body. It could not move what he had built inside it. It would be easy to romanticize this and skip past what it actually cost him. Musonius was not immune to hunger, thirst, or the ache of humiliation. He had been stripped of the status he'd earned over a lifetime and reduced, in the eyes of Rome, to a criminal on a rock. Ancient sources described the island's water as barely drinkable, its heat relentless, its isolation total for months at a stretch between visiting ships. He had every rational justification to become bitter, to spend his exile cataloging injustice, replaying the arrest, cursing Nero's name into the wind. Instead, he treated the exile itself as raw material for his philosophy rather than proof against it. He had spent years teaching students that a person's essential dignity depends on their choices, not their circumstances, that fortune can seize your property, your title, even your homeland, but it cannot force your judgment to agree with despair. Gyaros was the exam for everything he had claimed to believe. He did not fail it. He simply kept teaching, because teaching was the one act still entirely within his control. What makes Musonius genuinely radical, though, isn't just his composure, it's who he insisted deserved philosophy in the first place. Long before his exile, back in Rome, he had argued forcefully and controversially that women should study philosophy exactly as seriously as men, that they were equally capable of courage, self-control, and wisdom, and that denying them education was simply cultural habit dressed up as natural law. He argued that daughters deserved the same rigorous training in virtue as sons. He insisted that slaves possessed the same rational capacity for a well-ordered life as any senator, even if society refused them the same rights. In an empire built on rigid hierarchy where philosophy was largely the property of elite men, this was not a minor academic position. It was a quiet, sustained challenge to the entire social order. It's likely no accident that a man making these arguments eventually found himself on a boat to a waterless island. Ideas that widen who is allowed to think for themselves had always made the powerful uncomfortable, in Rome and everywhere since. Nero's reign ended in 68 AD, collapsing into chaos and his own suicide, and the new political winds briefly allowed Musonius to return to Rome. He resumed teaching, and among the students who gathered around him in this second act of his career was a young, disabled former slave named Epictetus, a name that would later echo through the centuries as one of Stoicism's most influential voices. It is a striking detail of history that the philosophy which would eventually shape emperors, generals, and modern psychologists first passed through the hands of a teacher who had already survived being discarded by Rome once. But peace did not last. Just a few years later, under a different emperor, Vespasian, philosophers were expelled from Rome again in a fresh political purge, and once more, Musonius Rufus was sent away, exiled a second time for the same essential crime, teaching people to examine their own lives too closely for the comfort of those in power. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people most. Musonius Rufus was, by later reputation, one of the most respected philosophers Rome ever produced, and yet almost none of his own writing survives in his own words. What we know of him comes almost entirely second-hand, filtered through students who wrote down his sayings, his classroom exchanges, his practical advice on marriage, food, clothing, and grief. He left behind no grand treatise, no monumental book with his name on the spine demanding to be remembered. His legacy is not a text. It is a chain of people, Epictetus among them, who carried his method of thinking forward because it had actually changed how they lived, not because it made for elegant prose. In an age obsessed with monuments, inscriptions, and permanent marble, Musonius built something that couldn't be melted down or defaced, a way of reasoning that other human minds kept transmitting, generation after generation, simply because it worked. So what, exactly, was the core of what he taught that made it worth swimming to an island for? Musonius argued, again and again, that philosophy was useless if it stayed theoretical, that the entire point of studying virtue was to train yourself, through daily practice, to handle real hardship when it arrived uninvited. He compared philosophical training to the conditioning of an athlete. You do not wait for the wrestling match to test your strength for the first time. You build it in advance, deliberately, through repetition, so that when the real contest comes, your body already knows what to do. He applied this same logic to the mind. Grief, insult, poverty, exile. These were not abstract topics to be debated in comfort. They were the wrestling match itself, and the only real question was whether you had trained beforehand. Gyaros was, in this light, not an interruption of his philosophy. It was simply the match he had been training for all along, and he walked onto that rock already prepared. There's a particular teaching of his that lands differently once you know his biography. He told his students that exile, of all human misfortunes, was one of the least deserving of our fear, because a person carries their reasoning, their character, and their capacity for a good life with them wherever they go. The land beneath your feet, he argued, was never truly the source of your peace of mind. Rome was not virtuous because it was Rome. A barren Aegean rock was not worthless simply because it lacked comfort. What made a place bearable or unbearable was almost entirely the quality of judgment the person brought to it. This wasn't a comforting platitude offered from safety. It was a claim tested twice against his own life by two different emperors on two separate islands. Most philosophers who write about hardship have the luxury of writing from a library. Musonius wrote his philosophy quite literally from the wreckage the empire built specifically to break men like him, and it held. It's worth pausing on the sheer strangeness of the historical detail again. Students swimming through open Aegean water toward an island the Roman state had designated as a place of erasure. Imagine the calculation those young men made. Risking drowning, risking the current, risking whatever punishment awaited anyone caught associating with an exiled dissident, because they judged an afternoon of conversation with this particular teacher worth more than their own safety. That is not the behavior of people attending an academic lecture. That is the behavior of people who believe a specific mind holds something they cannot get anywhere else in the empire. Nero's sentence had been designed to make Musonius invisible, unreachable, forgotten. Instead, it accidentally created one of the most dramatic advertisements imaginable for the value of his teaching. You cannot buy that kind of proof. You can only earn it, slowly, through decades of being the kind of thinker people are willing to risk something for. When we tell stories about ancient philosophers, we tend to picture serene old men in togas dispensing calm wisdom from marble porticos, untouched by real danger. Musonius Rufus breaks that image completely. He was arrested. He was stripped of status twice by two different regimes. He was sent to one of the harshest exile sites the Roman world had, and after finally returning, he was banished again for the exact same convictions. His life was not a peaceful seminar. It was a repeated, brutal test of whether his ideas could survive contact with actual power, actual deprivation, actual isolation. And each time, rather than revise his philosophy downward to something safer, he kept teaching the same core claim: your judgment is the one territory tyranny cannot conquer without your permission. 2 emperors tried to prove him wrong by force. Neither succeeded. That is not a comforting bedtime story about ancient wisdom. It is a documented outcome, repeated twice, under 2 different rulers who had every incentive to break him and simply couldn't. So here is the modern application, stripped of ancient robes and Aegean scenery. Most of us will never be exiled to a barren island by an emperor, but nearly all of us will, at some point, face a version of Musonius's tests in miniature. A job lost without warning, a relationship ending, a diagnosis, a public failure, a place we're suddenly forced to be that we did not choose and cannot leave. The instinct in these moments is to treat our circumstances as the entire verdict on our life, to wait passively until the external situation improves before we allow ourselves to function well again. Musonius's answer, tested twice under imperial force, was the opposite: identify, right now, before the crisis even arrives, what part of this situation is actually yours to control, your attention, your effort, your response to the people in front of you, and train that part deliberately, today, in small ways, the way an athlete drills before the match. Do not wait for your own Gyaros to discover whether you've been practicing.